Wyoming Territory, January 1873. The knock came just after dawn, hard and fast against the wooden door, like someone too cold to care about manners. Elias North had an axe in one hand and frost caught in his beard when he pulled the door open. The snow had drifted high overnight, halfway up the porch rail, and the wind howled behind her like it wanted to drag her back. She stood there wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her cheeks raw with windburn, arms wrapped around two thin, shivering children. Her eyes wide, dark, desperate, met his like a punch to the gut. "I do not want trouble," she said, voice trembling, "but we have not eaten in 2 days. Please, they are just children." Elias stared at her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, her face hollowed by hunger but proud. The boy, no more than 8, clutched her skirt, trying not to cry. The little girl, younger, buried her face in her brother's side, coughing weakly. "I got wood to chop," Elias said, but his voice came out wrong, rough. He stepped back. "Come in before you freeze to death." Her legs almost gave out from relief. She ushered the children inside, then hesitated, standing in the doorway like she expected someone to yell at her. Elias didn't. He closed the door behind her. The cabin was rough but warm. He had a fire going and a pot of beans on the stove. She glanced around like she had not seen a roof in weeks. The children collapsed near the hearth, too tired to speak. Elias handed her a cup of water. "Name?" She took it with both hands, eyes still fixed on him like she did not trust what was happening. "Keziah Monroe." He nodded once. "I am Elias North." "Sit down, Keziah." She did. They ate in silence, the children too hungry for words. Elias filled their bowls twice. Keziah barely touched her own until the children had eaten everything they could hold. Afterward, the little girl crawled into her lap and fell asleep. Elias watched them, arms crossed, back against the wall. "You lost your wagon?" "No wagon." She looked into the fire. "We had a cabin south of here. Neighbors were the only help we had. Then the fever came. My husband died. No one else came after that. You walked here 3 days." She ran a hand over her daughter's hair. "I did not know where else to go. There was a man in town who said you lived up here alone. Said you would not shoot a woman with children at your door." Elias muttered under his breath. "That would be Selah's. Damn fool talks too much." Keziah said nothing. He stared at the snow piling against the window. He never wanted a bride. Never wanted company or chatter or the kind of grief that came from loving people who could die on you. But now there was a woman in his chair with 2 half-starved children asleep at her side, and he could not seem to make himself tell them to leave. "How old's the boy?" "Jacob is 8. She looked down at the girl. "This is Junie. She is 5. You have people, not anymore." Elias rubbed his jaw. "You can stay through the storm. After that we will figure something out." Keziah nodded, her eyes full of something he could not name. The storm lasted 2 days. On the 3rd morning, the sky cleared and the sun made the snow shine like glass. Elias found Keziah outside, arm deep in the chicken coop, teeth clenched, trying to wrestle eggs from a stubborn hen. "You do not have to do chores." "I do not sit idle while someone feeds my children." He raised an eyebrow. "You always this proud?" She stood, brushing snow from her skirt. "You always this rude?" He laughed, a short thing that surprised both of them. She smiled then. Not wide, just enough to show she had not forgotten how, by the end of the week, Junie was laughing again, chasing the hens. Jacob followed Elias into the woods and asked 100 questions about trapping. Keziah kept the cabin clean, mended clothes, and made stew out of almost nothing. Elias found himself watching her when she was not looking. The way she moved quiet and steady, like she had always lived here. The way she checked on the children in the night, even when she was bone-tired. She never spoke about her husband. Elias did not ask. One night, as the fire cracked low, she sat sewing near the hearth. He carved a new handle for his axe. Jacob and Junie were asleep in the loft. "You never married?" She asked quietly. He shook his head. "Never saw the point," she nodded. "And now," he paused, knife still in his hand. "Now, I do not know." She looked at him, eyes soft. "I was not looking for a man, just a roof, a warm place for them. You found it." She dropped her gaze. "I did." That night, Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had kept to himself for years, chose it, preferred it. But the cabin felt different now, warmer, fuller, like it had been missing something he had forgotten he needed. He had never wanted a bride. But Keziah Monroe had arrived on his porch half frozen and proud, carrying 2 children and more grit than any man he had ever met. And something in him had shifted. He was not sure what to do about it yet. But he knew this much: he was not letting them walk back into the cold. The creek behind the cabin had begun to thaw by mid-February, water running slow beneath a skin of ice. Elias stood on the bank, boot soles sunk deep into the half-melted snow, watching Jacob try to skip stones across the sluggish current. The boy's arm was strong but wild. Most of the rocks sank without a sound. "What's the trick to it?" Jacob asked, frowning at the water. Elias crouched beside him, picked up a flat stone and tossed it low across the surface. It danced 3 times before vanishing. "Angles everything. You want the rock to kiss the water, not dig into it." He handed Jacob another stone. "Try again." The boy's next throw got 2 skips. He let out a whoop, and Elias found his mouth pulling into a quiet grin. From higher up the bank, Keziah called down, "Don't let him fall in, Elias. I don't have enough dry socks left to spare another pair." Elias turned to answer, but she was already heading back toward the cabin, a basket hooked over her arm, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. She walked steady, but there was a new lightness to her steps these days, as though her body had remembered peace. Jacob kept throwing stones, and Elias stayed with him until the sun began to dip. They returned to the cabin with their hands cold and their cheeks flushed from the air. Inside, Junie sat on the floor with a bundle of sticks, arranging them into careful shapes. She looked up when the door opened and scrambled to her feet. "Ma said we're having corn cakes." Elias shut the door behind them. "You sound like that's better than gold." "It is," she said, her little face solemn. The table was already set. Keziah had laid out the cakes beside a pot of boiled turnips and a small dish of honey. Elias noted the way she'd folded the cloth beneath the bread tin, the corners tucked neat and precise. After they ate, Keziah pulled a stool close to the fire, her hands busy knitting. Jacob dozed in the corner, his head against a rolled coat. Junie lay curled on the floor, one thumb in her mouth, the other hand clutching a small cloth doll Keziah had sewn from an old sleeve. "You were quiet today," Keziah said, glancing up at Elias without stopping her work. He shifted in his chair, poking at the coals with the poker. "Thinking. About what?" He hesitated. "The land south of the ridge. I've kept it clear, but it's never been planted. You know anything about barley?" She paused, her needles still. "A little. My father grew it in Missouri. Why? Thinking about putting in a crop. Could use help with the soil come spring." Her gaze lingered on him. "That your way of saying you want us to stay?" He didn't look away from the fire. "I reckon I thought you already had." She set down her knitting, folded her hands in her lap. "You've been good to us, more than good. I don't expect it. I didn't come to trap a man. You didn't." Silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the stove and the faint rustle of wind across the shutters. Then Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think about what kind of life you'd want if you could choose it now? Not what you had, not what you lost. Just what might still be ahead." Keziah's voice was quiet. "I want my children to sleep warm. I want to wake up where I'm not afraid. I want to work hard and know it's for something that'll last." He nodded slowly. "That's a good answer." She studied him. "What would yours be?" He poked the fire once more, then set the poker aside. "I'd want someone who didn't need saving, but let me stand beside them anyway. I'd want hands that know how to work and a voice that doesn't flinch at silence. I'd want a home that didn't feel hollow when the day was done." Keziah's eyes didn't leave his. She stood and crossed the room, her step soft. At his side, she didn't speak, just laid her palm gently over his. He looked up at her, and there was something steadier than hope in his chest. It felt like something growing roots. She didn't move to pull away. He turned his hand and closed his fingers around hers, warm and certain. Neither of them smiled, but the silence between them felt full. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "Jacob wants a calf of his own come spring." Elias nodded. We'll find him one. And Junie's been asking for a swing. I can hang one from the cottonwood. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up. And me, you can have whatever you ask for. She didn't answer with words, just leaned her forehead lightly to his, the gesture small and sure. In the loft, Jacob stirred in his sleep. Junie murmured something against her doll, and the fire cracked on. Outside, the wind had stilled. Snow packed hard against the earth, but the land had begun to change beneath it. The first calf was born in late March. Slick and trembling in the straw of the lean-to shed Elias had built beside the barn. The birth had come sudden, just after dusk, and Jacob had been there when it happened, eyes wide, breath held, hands gripping the rough timber fence as if the world might tip if he let go. She did it, he whispered when the calf finally stood, wobbling under the mother's soft nudge. Elias passed him a towel. Dry him off careful, not too rough. Jacob nodded, stepping into the pen without hesitation. Keziah stood just beyond the gate, Junie asleep in her shawl against her chest, watching her son crouch beside the calf with a quiet awe that made her throat tighten. Elias met her gaze across the rail. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, rooted and wordless. By April, the thaw had taken the creek bank and the lower pasture. Elias turned the soil by hand at first, then by mule, and Keziah walked behind the plow, pulling stones from the furrows. They worked side by side, not speaking much, but each day they labored. Something else settled between them, closer than habit, deeper than duty. One morning, Keziah paused at the edge of the field, brushing her sleeve across her brow. Elias stood beside her, boots sunk in upturned earth. "You always planned to stay this far from town?" she asked. He took his time before answering. "Didn't figure I had much call for people. I was wrong about that." She leaned on the hoe, studying the horizon. "I used to think noise meant safety, neighbors, wagons passing, women at the well." "But too many voices don't make you less alone," Elias nodded. "Some quiet's worth more than company." She looked over then. "It is with the right person." He didn't speak, but the way his hand brushed hers just once, light as a breath, said more than his voice could have managed. That night, after Jacob finished brushing the mule and Junie had been carried to bed, Keziah stood at the table sewing patches into one of Elias's shirts. The room smelled of tallow and pine smoke, a faint edge of river mud on their boots. "You ever been to Cheyenne?" she asked, her fingers working the thread. "Once, years ago, didn't stay long. My uncle used to say it was too loud for honest thought." He wasn't wrong. She folded the shirt, placed it neatly beside the others. "There's a circuit preacher supposed to come through this valley in June." Elias didn't look up from the harness he was oiling, but his hand stilled. "You thinking of hearing him?" "I was thinking of asking if you might stand beside me while I do." He set the cloth down slow. "I'd stand wherever you asked." She crossed the room, quiet as dusk, and laid her palm against his chest. "Then I'll ask." He turned toward her, no sudden gesture, just the steady gravity of a man who'd walked out of his solitude and into something that felt like belonging. His hand settled at her waist, and the closeness between them was full of breath and rain-soaked earth and the comfort of knowing the answer before it was spoken. "I never wanted a bride," he said, voice low. "I never came looking for a husband. But here we are." Her smile wasn't wide, but it was certain. "Here we are." He bent his head then, and their foreheads touched in the hush of the warm, lit cabin. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and beneath it, the land held still, like it knew the shape of what was growing there. The sun rose earlier now, spilling gold across the eastern ridge before the rooster stirred. The frost still lingered in the shadows, but the air had loosened its grip. Keziah stepped barefoot onto the porch, her skirts gathered in one hand, the other holding Junie's small fingers. The girl blinked up at the light, eyelids still heavy with sleep. "You think the lupines will bloom this week?" Keziah asked, shielding her eyes. "They might," Elias said from the woodpile where he knelt sharpening a drawknife. "The bees are out already." Junie tugged gently on her mother's hand. "Can we pick some when they do?" Keziah glanced at Elias, waiting. He stood slowly, brushing sawdust from his knees. "We'll find the best patch after supper one night. Save him in a jar if you like." Junie nodded solemnly, then darted back inside to find her doll. Keziah stepped off the porch, the cool dirt pressing into her soles. "She's never had a spring without worry," she said softly. "This is the first time she's asked for something that wasn't food or fire." Elias looked at her, steady. "I want her to keep asking." She lifted her eyes to his, sunlight catching the strands of hair near her temple. "I do too." Later that morning, Jacob brought in a broken strap from the mule's harness. Elias took it from him and studied the frayed leather. "Could be mended, but it won't hold come hauling season. We'll need to ride to the trading post next week." Jacob's brows lifted. "Can I come?" Elias nodded. "We'll tie the old pack mule and bring back what we need." "You mind the weight, you can ride her part way." Keziah set her wash basin down near the well, wringing out the last of the linens. "If you're going that far, see if they've got lye soap. I'm low." Elias glanced toward her. "Anything else?" She wiped her hands dry on her apron. "A tin of chamomile if they carry it. Junie's been sleeping restless." Jacob crouched beside the mule, tracing the worn spot on the harness with his finger. "Will you get new boots, too?" Elias looked down at his feet. The leather was cracked across the toes. "Might be time." That evening, Keziah stood in the doorway while Elias nailed a new hinge on the barn gate. She had a book in her hand, pages faded, the binding soft with age. "I found this in the bottom of one of the old flour barrels," she said. Elias didn't look up. "Yours?" "No." "Someone must have left it here before you, the name's worn off the cover." He straightened, brushing the dust from his palms. "What kind of book?" "Poems." He raised an eyebrow. "You read them out loud." She opened to a marked page, voice quiet. "The wind blew out from the canyon mouth and carried my name through the timbers. I followed it out and found only silence, but the silence remembered me." Elias leaned a shoulder against the post. "I've never been one for poetry. I didn't used to be either." She closed the book. "But there's something in it that feels like sitting beside someone without talking." He crossed the space between them, slow. "Then maybe I do like it." She held the book to her chest. "After Junie sleeps, I'll read you the one about the river. It's not soft, but it's honest." He nodded. "That's the kind worth keeping." Inside, Junie's breathing had quieted in the loft, and Jacob was already curled beneath the wool blanket Keziah had patched with old flannel. The fire burned low as she read, seated near the hearth. Elias listened without moving, the words settling into the quiet like seeds into soil. When she closed the book, he didn't speak for a long moment. "Then, you think the preacher'll come in early?" She folded her hands. "Even if he doesn't, I'd still stand beside you." He looked at her then, not as the woman who'd arrived starved and raw, but as someone who had dug her hands into this life and helped shape it whole. "I've got a ring," he said. "It was my mother's. Been in a drawer near 20 years. Keziah's breath caught. "I don't need one. I want you to have it." The firelight caught the edge of her smile, small and certain. "Then I'll wear it." He reached for her hand and she gave it freely, her fingers warm against his. Outside, the night deepened, but the wind stayed still. Nothing rushed. Nothing needed to. They had already stepped into something lasting. The preacher came through on the second Sunday of June, riding a sway-backed gelding with a saddle worn smooth from years of travel. He didn't ask for coin, just water and a place to rest his horse. And when Keziah offered a fresh biscuit and a slice of salted pork, he bowed his thanks and said that would do fine. They stood beneath the cottonwood near the creek, where the grass had grown thick and sweet under the sun. The children sat on a quilt close enough to see but far enough not to fidget near the vows. Jacob had a wildflower tucked behind his ear, which he claimed was for good luck, though he wouldn't say whether it was his or theirs he was hoping to bless. Keziah wore a simple blue dress that Elias hadn't seen before. She said it had been her mother's, folded away in the bottom of her satchel since Missouri. The hem had been let down, the sleeves mended, but the color still held. She hadn't added a ribbon or lace, just washed it clean and worn it honest. Her hair was braided back, tucked into itself, and her hands were steady as she reached for his. Elias had trimmed his beard that morning, not much, just enough to look like he meant to be seen. The ring had been polished with lamp oil and wrapped in cloth until she was ready to wear it. He held it now, warm from his palm, waiting for the words to come. The preacher's voice was weathered but strong, and he asked no questions they weren't already living the answers to. When he finished, Keziah looked up at Elias, the wind lifting a strand of hair across her cheek. He brushed it back without thinking, and her eyes held to his like they were reading something only they could understand. "You sure?" he asked, low enough that only she could hear. "I've never been more." He slid the ring onto her finger and it fit without resistance. She didn't cry, neither did he. But something inside him settled so deep it felt like it had always been meant to rest there. Afterward, Junie clapped and ran to them, arms out, and Jacob stood tall like he'd had a hand in building this moment. Keziah crouched to hold them both, and Elias leaned down, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. That evening they ate outside under the last of the light. Keziah had made a pie from the chokecherries she'd gathered near the ridge, and though it was tart, there wasn't a crumb left by the time the stars came out. Later, after the children had curled up in the loft and the fire had burned down to embers, Elias reached for her hand where it rested on the quilt. "You ever think you'd end up married again?" he asked. "No," she said, without hesitation. "But I never thought I'd feel safe again, either," he nodded. "I used to think I'd spend my days tending fence and chopping wood until I wore out. Didn't seem like a bad way to go, just a lonely one." Keziah turned toward him, folding her legs beneath her. "You're not alone anymore." He studied the firelight dancing across her face. "No, I'm not." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with the kind of quiet that grows between two people who have already chosen each other 100 times in smaller ways. Her fingers curled into the fabric at his shoulder, and she didn't pull back. In the morning, the chickens clucked impatiently, and Junie hollered from the loft that the sun was too bright. Jacob stumbled down half-dressed, asking if the mule needed feeding. Life pressed on, as it always did. But Keziah stood in the doorway with her arms around Elias's waist, the ring catching the daylight as she reached up to brush his collar smooth. "Think we'll ever get a window in the loft?" she asked. "If I can find the glass, I'll build you one. I'd like that." They turned back toward the cabin, hand in hand, the door swinging wide behind them, years past quiet and full. The barley came in thick that August, and by the second autumn, Elias had built a second room off the back of the cabin. Jacob took to carpentry, his hands steady even as he grew taller, and Junie planted a row of wildflowers each spring beneath the cottonwood where her mother and Elias had stood. Keziah taught her to read by lamplight during the winter evenings, while Elias carved new handles and kept the fire stoked. They buried the old mule in the pasture when the time came and raised a calf from the one born that first spring. The barn filled with hens and laughter, and never again did anyone wonder where they belonged. Elias kept the ring on the nightstand when he worked the land, but every evening before supper he would slip it back on without saying a word. Keziah noticed always. She never said anything either. And sometimes, when the sky turned soft with dusk and the wind moved gentle through the grass, they would sit on the porch in silence, her hand resting lightly over his, as if to say, "We made it. We're here. We're whole." And they were.